All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Janella Esparza, a museum educator of family programs at the McNay Art Museum. Welcome and thank you for registering and participating in this virtual workshop, Plant Therapy 101. This workshop is in conjunction with our current exhibition, Is It Real? Staging Nature in the Tobin Exhibition Galleries at the museum. It opened on April 22nd, and you have until October 24th of this year in the fall to go and check that out. We're really honing in on the nature part of that title with today's workshop. And we all know that plants, whether they've been your friend for a long time, a lot of us are pretty new to it. So we thought it'd be fun to have a little plant therapy session and just talk all things plants. And the best person to do that is our plant guru on staff, Juan Zavala Castro. I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's so good to see everybody. Um, you know, I feel like I self-identified as a plant guru after starting to collect plants in 2012 after a ceramics mishaps, because I'm an art student, right? Initially, I work at the McNay Art Museum. So initially, I'm an art student. So while I was making this cup in the wheel, I accidentally made a hole, but I really liked it. I thought it was a really nice cup. So my professor said, like, why don't you try a plant? Put a plant in it. I went to Lowe's, I got a succulent, I put it in there, and that's all it took. You know, since 2012 up until now, I've been super obsessed with it. And I really like to research and I like to get informed. I've been collecting plants for that long, but I really specialize in these plants right here, which are called Monstera. There are some aroids, which are really most of the house plants that we have. Most of the house plants kind of come from the same family, from the same region, because they really require the same things, right? Not a lot of light, not a lot of humidity. They're kind of like jungle plants, but ironically, our houses are kind of perfect little ecosystems for those kind of plants because the temperature is nice, the lighting is nice. So it's what I kind of specialized in. So I ended up specializing in house plants per se. But I have a little bit of pull right here because I want to know how long you guys have been into plants. And this is just something I came up with. The answers here are describe your plant experience, which best describes you. I don't have experience, but I know someone who does. I want a green thumb, but I'm just tipping my toe. I recently discovered my love for plants and I'm all in now. I've always had them, but they require more TLC. And then my personal favorite, I think the one that I fall into, which is I talk to my plants more than talk to my husband or wife, which I mean, I think is pretty obvious. And yes, they do better when you talk to them. They do like it. Let's see. So I'm seeing a lot of I want a green thumb and recently discovered my love for plants. Yep. I've had them for a while, but they could use more TLC. Those are pretty even. I don't have experience, but I know someone who does. Is getting a little bit of responses. Yeah, and that feel like that was it's been a pretty recent thing in 2020 since we were all pretty much shut inside for a while. We got kind of stuck into our surroundings, so we are kind of forced to look at our white walls. And I feel like a lot of people's responses to that was to add, a plant here and there, and everybody getting started, getting obsessed with them, which is pretty great. So I'm gonna give this a little bit more time. And if anybody feels like unmuting at any time or sharing, your own plant experience on the chat, feel free to do so because I always love to hear those. I know some people have really good stories of family members having plants, and I'm kind of inheriting that tradition. I feel like for me it was the complete opposite. I was the lone wolf in my in my household. I grew plants and nobody knew why. But I do envy the people that have a really rich tradition in their family of loving plants and keeping plants. So it looks like recently discovered my love for plants. One, but only for a little bit, follow closely by, oh, actually, no, I've always had them, but they could use more TLC, took a turn. They took it right at the end. Yeah, so recently discovered my love for plants and I want to green thumb. All right, so we have an audience of mostly new people, which, totally works. Susan says I stopped keeping plants inside when I got a cat who loved eating them. Yeah, that's a huge issue. Some of them are toxic, so that's something to do keep in mind. But all right, I think with that said, we can get started. Like we said in the description, today we're going to cover light, we're going to cover watering, fertilizer, and propagation, which I thought was kind of the best introduction to everything, but we are going to get a little bit nerdy. We're going to get a little bit nerdy. We're going to talk about a lot of the details that are often like overlooked when we talk about fertilizer, especially when we talk about light. So hopefully we can get through this. And if I lose somebody in the process, do let me know. Please unmute and yeah, have a conversation with me. But with that being said, I'm going to switch my camera to here, and I have a notepad. And here I'm just going to go along and illustrate everything here. Megan says, can't seem to keep a Persian shield alive no matter what I do, but it's my favorite plant. Megan, I'm going to have to familiarize myself with that plant because I usually know them by their Latin name, a Persian shield. Maybe you describe it, I'll be able to know which one that is. But let's get started, right? So we're thinking about light, right? Light for plants. It's kind of a very common thing to think about when thinking about plants, to just think, well, they need light, obviously, right? But light is a very tricky subject, right? Because we often hear about east-facing windows, north-facing windows, what kind of strong, medium, or highlight, and those kind of things that get a little bit confusing, right? So we can think like, what's a low light plant? What's a highlight plant? Well, to begin with that, all plants need some amount of light, right? I've heard some people say like, what plant can I keep in my bathroom if I have no windows? A plastic one, really, is the answer to that. It's really hard to keep plants in like no light whatsoever, but there are some plants that really thrive in very, very low amounts of light. But we can explain light altogether. Now, the measurement that I use mostly for all my plants and my plant keeping is foot candles. So I'm just going to write FTC for foot candles. And this is a measurement of light that is basically representative of how much how much light a candle emits a foot away. So there's 200 foot candles. So if you had 200 candles, how much light would that emit a foot away? So it kind of puts an image in your brain of to what kind of light to expect, right? If you think about 20-foot candles and 4,000-foot candles, that's kind of where the difference lies, and that's kind of how we interpreted this measurements, right? In the summer outside, it can be to 5,000-foot candles, sometimes 8,000-foot candles, just in direct sun. So a lot of plants are not going to really like that, right? They get burned, they get sun marks, they get bleached. So it's kind of a very tricky thing to do. So our eyes tend to adjust to a lot of lighting, and we often think like, oh, this might be good for a plant, right? But our eyes don't photosynthesize, so they don't necessarily have the same requirements. A lot of offices, a lot of those environments can seem like they're well lit, but they might not be, right? So just to begin, I have some measurements that I usually tend to go by, and I have a little light meter that kind of looks like this. It's used by photographers. It just has like a light sensor, a screen, and some buttons on the side. And this screen sensor tests the foot candles for me.
You can even download digital light meters on your phone now. They're not as accurate, but they give you a
I
good
feel,
range.
yeah, I feel like they're accurate enough for plants, right? Because you're not necessarily doing anything too scientific. So if you can get a range, that's pretty good. Even here, I have 200 to 500 foot candles, which is really pretty low in terms of plants. A good range in there should be fine. I always do 200 to 500, then I do 500 to 1,000, 1,000 to 1,500, and then 1,500 plus. So this is pretty crazy. Like I would call this cactus lighting, things like that. So anything like that is a house plant will probably do good around this area. And we can talk about what that kind of looks like. So the 200 to the 500, it's low light. It's what they call it deep shade. It's far away from windows, and it's maybe overhead lighting only, right? So imagine that you have a window right here in your house, and this is your wall. So the plant would be here, right? So we'll put a little plant right there, right? So this I would call, 200 to 500 foot candles. And it also depends what kind of window this is and what season we're in, right? The lighting in the winter tends to be lower. In the summer, obviously, it's a little bit hotter. So if you have a north-facing window, which are the ones that get the least amount of light, that might be good in the summer, and it might keep something like a ZZ plant, a snake plant. Those plants will probably do really well in a northern exposure in the summer. But in the winter, it might be a little bit challenging for that plant to grow, and we might look into supplemental lighting, which is grow lights and things like that. Which, if you have a questions on grow lights, please do ask me. I didn't write too much about it, but I did I did do a lot of crazy research when I was buying mine. So if you have some questions, please put it in the chat or just unmute, and we'll be happy to answer. So that's kind of what we're thinking. We're thinking of 200 to 500, far away from windows. They're in deep shade. You're only getting lighting from the top, right? It's not the most ideal place for a plant. Sadly, this seems to be like the place where we want to put plants the most, right? Because we want our windows to be open and for us to be able to see. So the plant will be really good on this end. It depends on the window, right? So we have next one is moderate light, right? So we're in the 500 to 1,000, and moderate is really close to the window. It's nearby. It may receive some morning sun, but it's not directly lit, right? So this, I would say, like where my hand is right now is moderate light, right? I have a window that's about like 5 feet away. So this light right here would probably be good for a pothos, something that grows really big but doesn't really require a lot of plants, a lot of growth and a lot of light. I would keep something like a snake plant here, and it will probably get really huge and really happy on this area. So if you can see my hand, right, it's kind of lit. You can read a book really comfortably here. And that's, I think, the measurement of lighting that it's easiest to go by. The least amount where you can read a book comfortably, that's where I would keep a plant. Anything less, I don't think it'll work too well. The 1,000 to the 1,500, I would call it highlight. And it's near windows. It receives direct light, maybe the afternoon. There might be some shade, right? So in the afternoon, the light is more intense. It's also hotter. So that's something to keep in mind, just to make sure we're not too close to the window so they don't get burned. But it's ideal for plants that you want to flower, right? So if you're growing plants like something like a jasmine inside, or you're growing like fruit trees inside, this kind of lighting, which is the high lighting, would be better, right? And higher lights are when the plants will flower more frequently. So if you want something that has really thick foliage or requires a lot of light, I would put it really close to the window, and make sure it's getting some sunlight, whether it's in the morning or a little bit on the afternoon. The morning's a little bit better because it's nicer, it's more gentle. And I see Francesca has a question. Yes, Francesca.
How many hours of light?
It depends, right? So in the morning, I would say 6. In the afternoon, I wouldn't do past 4. But if you're doing grow lights, if you're doing supplemental lighting, I do 12 hours of supplemental lighting. When it's natural light, it's a little bit better because it tends to increase and decrease naturally, right? And plants are kind of used to that dynamic. But when it's supplemental lighting, like grow lights, the more the better, really. I've seen people that grow plants 24/7 in very low light, and they just get constant light. But I feel like that's too crazy, so I just do 12.
There's also a question in the chat from Nancy Schweer. She says, "Can I grow a vine from a sweet potato from the grocery store?"
Nancy, you can absolutely grow a sweet potato vine. Yeah, so those are tubercules, so it's already a root. Anything that's a potato, a carrot, all of those things, they're already roots. So all you're doing is growing the vegetative growth and reproducing those roots. So if it's a sweet potato, carrot, a potato itself, just cut it. Make sure you have they call it an eye, but it's almost like a node for reproduction, and we'll get into that for propagation. I think that'll be something good to cover. But just to round off the thing, we have 1,500 plus, right? This is directly in front of the windows, and it gets total afternoon sun. And this is really, really big windows, right? So this would be cactus lighting. If I have people that are into orchids, there's a very specific orchid species called Cattleya orchids. They're really pretty. They're not the ones we find at they're not this one that kind of looks like this. They're not that one. It's another different one. These require very little light. The cattleys require more light, so this is like high intensity light. These are almost lower. This could be well around here. But we did talk about north and south facing windows. So what does that mean, right? So how do we interpret those things, right? North facing windows are the weakest light. They usually don't get as much sun, and that's only because we live in the northern hemisphere, right? So we have the world here, the sun revolves around here, we're kind of over here, the sun is here, emitting rays this way. We're not going to get a lot of light from the top. So any north-facing windows will only benefit from the light that's, outside and may not be totally suitable for a lot of things. The strongest, obviously, is south, because as the sun moves east to west, it always has a southern exposure, right? So southern-facing windows, if you're keeping cactus inside, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend, but if you do, a really good southern-facing window will kind of get lighting throughout the whole day. East and west. East gets the morning light, which I tend to prefer. It's a little bit more gentle, but the west facing windows get the afternoon sun. So if you have a lot of plants and you have a really nice window, that can be really good. Just quick dosage of lighting. I hope that's making sense, and I'm not I'm not going too fast. But another good way to measure, right? Because sometimes there will be a tree, like for example, have a tree outside of this window that's illuminating me. So that's taking some light away. So it doesn't really matter what kind of exposure I have or what direction my window's on. If we have something that blocks it, or the size of the window also plays a huge factor into the lighting. So a really good way that I tell lighting is, let me see if I can cast a shadow right there. So if you see my shadow, you see a fuzzy shadow, right? It's kind of fuzzy even when I put my hand down, right? It's not extremely defined, and that would be moderate lighting. If, for example, I move closer to this area, let's see if I can block the light with this. See how now my hand is not really casting a shadow right there. See, it's really hard to define the shadow of my hand from the shadow normally unless I move it. Once I move this, you can see my shadow. If you don't see a shadow, that is low light, suitable for only some plants. And you'd have to do a little bit of research. If you see a fuzzy shadow like this, that's moderate lighting. But if you see a really well-defined, really sharp shadow, that is what I would describe as highlight. And let me see if I can see how you can see that shadow. And it's pretty sharp. And I'm just using my camera flash. Even when I kind of bring it out, you can still see that shadow being pretty well defined. When I turn it off, it gets really fuzzy. So that's moderate light. Sharp shadows are highlight. So just to bring it all home, I have a living room here, which I thought this might be cute. So I kind of brought a living room, and I found this image on Google, but I really liked it because it really encapsulates and it shows everything. So if you see the shadow right here, it's a very sharp shadow. This one right here is very fuzzy, and there's no shadow whatsoever. So this is a northern facing light. This would technically be a south-facing light, even though it's not making too much sense. This is an edited image. Don't worry about it too much. And I would say this is like east or west. This house curves. Don't worry about this. But if I was to put some plants in here, some of them do good, some of them not as much. But if you had something like a tree or a fiddle leaf fig, which I know are really popular nowadays, if you had something like a tree, I would probably put it in some strong but gentle lighting. Something like a bird of paradise. Also needs lots of growth, lots of light. I would put it in the gentle lighting. Let's see. This to me looks like a spathiphyllum or a peace lily. Those don't require a lot of light. Those are one of the few plants that can actually live in dark corners, right? So this window is still getting a lot of light just based on my visual assessment. So I would put it here, right? This is a snake plant. I would put it there as well. Something like an alocasia or something that's, from a tube that has fleshy leaves that kind of tend to fade. So this kind of plants will have a leaf, but they will drop it and then will grow more and they will drop it. Those don't really need a lot of light because they just need the light to make the energy to produce one leaf, right? So if you want, that here, you can put it here to get bigger. And lastly, I have something that I thought was funny, is leaves and a base. So I would put those probably over here, right? Because it's always nice to have some sort of plant somewhere, but it's just important to know where to put them, right? So just a thing to keep in mind is strong light is good for bigger plants. It's good for plants that are, need a little bit more growth, right? A little bit more oomph if you want them to flower, if you want them to get bigger. But it's also case by case basis, right? If you are seeing burning, bleaching, or your leaves are getting yellow, consider moving it backwards, consider moving to another window, things like that. How's everybody doing? Are we good? Good. Yep. I see some nuts. All right, so now I think I want to move on to the easiest thing probably to mess up, but also to master, which is watering, right? So when it comes to watering, there's the overwaterers and the underwaterers, and this is really depends on your stage of your plant love. I feel like when I first started having plants, I was a heavy overwaterer. I would water too much. I had too much time, right? And I really loved all of my plants. So I wanted to dote over them constantly. So I would water them probably more than I should. So if we have, let's just say we have a pot. Let's draw a quick pot, right? Hope you guys can see that. Right, we have a pot. There are some plants that don't really need all that water, and you can kind of tell by looking at them. Some of them do, some of them don't. But if you're really getting into plants and you're like really just seeing them and want to know how to care for them just on visual cues, you can actually look at the plant itself and kind of tell how much water it can need. Something like a ponytail palm that has a big codex or a big trunk, right? And then it has all these crazy, beautiful leaves that we love. All of this trunk right here is used to store water, right? All of our succulents, when they have those nice, big, juicy leaves, all of the leaves in there are water storage, right? And even things that you wouldn't really think can store water. For example, my favorite kind of plant, which are the Monstera, they have a really thick stem, right? So if you see a plant with a really thick stem that the leaves come out of, and the stem looks really like woody, those are structures that are meant for water keeping. So if you have a tree and it has a really thick stem, that's something that you don't necessarily need to water all that much. And if you do, it's a little more susceptible to root rot. So that's something kind of to keep in mind. If you really want to like go to HEB, go to Home Depot or the plant nursery or the plant shop and find a plant that you like, those are things that I sometimes look for, because I feel like now having a lot of plants, I've become an underwaterer. So now I don't water as much. So if I want a plant that I think is exciting, I find something that has thick, fleshy leaves. Those things will kind of keep alive for a longer time. Now, in the opposite side, there's things like the Fittonia or the nerve plant, which have really perky but really thin leaves, right? So they'll just have this very thin papery leaves and a very like dinky stem, right? And that consists of the whole plant. Sometimes they may branch out and they may have other leaves, but if you see a structure here that doesn't have a thick stem, it doesn't have thick leaves, and it doesn't have, for example, like an alocasia or plants like that have a tuber or a bulb, right? Because a lot of plants like tulips and things like that will have a bulb under the dirt. This is also to store water. Even though all we see is this stores the water. So if you have a plant that doesn't really have any of that, it just has distant roots, this will probably require more water. Some of them are more dramatic than others. Some of them will tell you like, hey, give me a drink. Pothos are really good at that. Pothos will get really sad and you'll think like, oh shoot, I have to water this plant, right? And those are kind plants to have because they kind of communicate and tell you. But even if you look at a pothos plant, the leaves are thin, the stem is not too juicy, it doesn't have any systems to store water, it's not rooting on anything, the roots are thin. Those are just things to consider and to kind of keep in mind. Now, if you do have one of these plants and you still want to water them thoroughly, there's things you can do, right? So there's ceramic pots, and the ceramic pots will draw away some of that moisture from the dirt and kind of put it out into the environment. I use these particularly to raise the humidity in my plant room and my grow space, because I feel like houseplants do benefit a lot from that. They feel like they grow a little bit more, a little bit faster if they have a higher environment. So a lot of the times I will use clay pots with just dirt and water the dirt. I know it sounds crazy, but it's kind of worked out for me a little bit. But if I had a plant in there that required a lot of water like this, I would water this all the time in a clay pot. In a clay pot, it would dry out all the time and it would constantly need water, and that water seeping into my plant. If I didn't want to water all that much, I would move to plastic or glass, something that's not porous, that would retain the water in there and kind of keep me from having to water so much, if that makes sense. And I do want to look over at the chat. Megan, I'll have to look that up. That plant evades me. There are so many beautiful plants. I'm still trying to figure out what the Persian shield is, but I will Google it and tell you. Let's see. Does anybody have any questions so far? Are we doing good? Yep. I see some heads moving.
I looked up Persian shield plant.
Uh-huh.
It's got like purple leaves with green veins, really long, slender leaves.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I see it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Let's
really
see.
beautiful.
The question was, and Megan, if you want to unmute and talk to me, that's totally doable.
I just can't keep the plant alive no matter where I move it. If I water it a little bit or water it a lot, it never goes through more than one season.
Yeah, I would just looking at this, right, and based on the things that I know, I would think it's one of these. It actually looks really similar to this drawing, funny enough. It might be one of those water needy plants that you can think about. So I would try potting it in a bigger pot, right, than you think, because that also keeps them wet for longer. So if I have a small plant in a huge pot, this dirt will stay wet for a long time. That might be bad for something like this, something that has aquatics, something that stores water, a cactus. But for a plant that needs a lot of water, that might be good, right? There's also amendments to your soil, perlite and vermiculite and things like that. Those are usually really good. I would give it a go. I would give it a go with more water and then see where you end up with that.
What do you think about the light part?
The light part, it depends, right? Because when not seeing it in person, usually something that's fuzzy or that you see that feels velvety will usually not require that much light. Plants that have a harder leaf will usually, and I say usually because there's an exception for everything, but usually require a stronger light. So we were talking about this ponytail palm. If you've seen the leaves of a ponytail palm, they're very, very hard, right? They feel like almost like razor sharp, like agave, all those things. The harder the leaf, the more light usually. The softer the leaf, the more velvety. I would say less light, but nothing dark. Like we talked about, you kind of want something like this, right? This nice moderate light. And I sat here purposely. These plants that are behind me don't live here at all. I wanted to stage nature like our show exhibition, so that we can have a good example of good lighting.
The Persian shield is usually grown outdoors
Mm.
just for a season. It's called a sensitive perennial, but it won't, where I live in Texas, you can't go through the winter. So I'm trying to grow it inside and I just haven't been able to, but I'm going to try some of these things you say.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I would try. Yeah, thank you. I would definitely try some of those, but it might not want to be outside, right? Not every plant is a house plant, sadly. But there is ways to try it.
There was a comment from Cheryl Lovett where she says she grew a hanging sweet potato plant from a grocery store picking, and she would like to show it to us. So I'm just going to like temporarily pin or add a spotlight so she can show us. Let me see
Let's
that.
do it.
Oh,
Whoa,
wow.
Cheryl.
Wowzers. That's so amazing. Did you start that in water and then put it to soil?
I put it directly in the potting soil.
Lovely. It looks so happy and healthy.
Yeah, those are beautiful leaves, Cheryl. They look
Thank you so
amazing.
much for sharing.
You're welcome.
Man, we'll just let Cheryl teach the class now. 'Cause Cheryl, that was a beautiful plant. All right. I think we can move on to perhaps my favorite, but this is where I lose a lot of people, which is fertilizer. Right. So fertilizer is something that we don't really think about when we're thinking about houseplants, especially when we're starting out. It's something that, you know, it's kind of second nature. It talks about the longevity of plants. So if you have a plant that you really, really like and you want to see it thrive and live for years and years, this is something that I really consider, right? So I often get asked why fertilize and like, do I really need to fertilize? But when we think about plants, they all come from outside, right? And the outside, they have dead leaves, like matter, but biological matter that decomposes. We have animal droppings, and all those things keep the plant alive. When we pot a plant and put it in the soil, we just keep it root bound to these conditions, and nothing can change. Right? That's why things tend to go wrong really quickly. A lot of plant problems are fertilizer problems, and we just don't really know it. When our leaves turn yellow, when they turn to mush, or when they start to die really quickly, when your plant just quickly takes a turn, it might be a fertilizing issue. But fertilizing is really, really complicated sometimes. And it all comes down to what kinds you pick. So this is my favorite part, so I'll try to go a little bit slowly, but if I do get enthusiastic and just start rambling, do stop me, because I will talk about fertilizer all day, every day. But there's usually, right, because there's always an exception, there's 3 types of fertilizers. So there's water soluble, which is my personal favorite because I get to control how much. There's slow release, and then there's fertilizer sticks. Out of these, I think the sticks are the most ineffective. And these are just the most common ones. I think the sticks are the most ineffective. You often see them as, they're called plant sticks, and you'll just see this like little piece of wood at Lowe's or something like that. And you're supposed to put it really close to the stem, but it doesn't really give fertilizer that accurately, right? The slow release fertilizer is something, if you ever bought a bag of Miracle-Gro or something like that, and you see like the small beads that kind of look like insect eggs, and you can like squish them, right? That's the type of fertilizer that they use, and it's called slow release because it comes with a membrane that will slowly dissipate, releasing the fertilizer into the soil, right? Which is something that I like. I like when I'm starting a plant, or when I want a plant to get big and I don't want to really worry about it. But the one that I like the most is the water soluble, right? So the water soluble fertilizers will be liquids, or crystals that you can put into water and mix and kind of dissolve into the water. And there's different kinds for all this, right? There's organic and inorganic fertilizers. Organic fertilizers, they're made with organic things. Oftentimes they're made with seaweed, which I think I recommend those the most, the seaweed fertilizers. If we're talking brands, because I do like certain brands better. I like Liquid Dirt, and I'll put it in the chat in a bit. There's other called Neptune's Harvest, and those are all natural fertilizers that I really, really like. And they're organic fertilizers, so they're made from organic matter. There's synthetic fertilizers, which are made from the synthesized minerals that the plants require. I like those too, but they tend to be a little bit stronger when you mix them. So if you ever picked up a bottle of fertilizer or anything of fertilizer, it'll usually come with a number like 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, or 1, 3, 0. Or sometimes they're like 20, sometimes they're crazy, and they're like 20, 10, 5, right? And these numbers can be really confusing because they have no entry point at all whatsoever in the bottle. But these numbers are what they're called, it's called the NPK values. I don't know if you're seeing that in reverse, but I'll just write it. And hopefully just with me saying it, it makes sense. There's the NPK values, right? The N stands for nitrogen. Nitrogen. The P stands for phosphorus. And the K stands for potassium. So these 3 things are macronutrients in plants. So this is what plants need the most. It's not necessarily all they need, but it's what they need the most, right? Or the bigger quantities of. If you see a fertilizer, if you're walking around Lowe's or Home Depot or the plant store, and you see a fertilizer that has a value of like 10, 10, 10, it's called a balanced fertilizer. That means it has an equal value or percentage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in the bottle, right? So you think like, okay, it has 10%, 10%, 10%. What's the other 70%? It's usually water, it's usually additives, things that don't necessarily do anything to the plant, or it can be some of those micronutrients that the plants really require. The synthetic ones will be higher, the natural ones will be a little bit lower. And I just like those because they don't burn your plants. Synthetic fertilizers can often burn the leaves or the roots if you use too much. I actually recommend to always half the dose of use a synthetic. So if you see a fertilizer that has a higher value than 10, and it tells you like use it once a week and put 5 grams per gallon of water, I would reduce that by half. So I would use 2.5 per gallon of water, and I usually do it. It's something they call weekly. So you do a week mix every week. So week like I'm not too strong, and weekly like a day of the week. So that's usually the best fertilizing regime for the things. But we talked about the NPK values. What does this do? What do these things do? Right? Nitrogen, it's related, or it's responsible for plant growth, right? So in order for the plant to get big, it needs lots of nitrogen. We talked about earlier today about natural things that you may have in the home, like coffee grounds. Coffee grounds have a lot of nitrogen in them, right? It's mixed with some stuff that I don't prefer. I prefer to just buy a bottle than use coffee grounds, but it's something that's totally doable, something you can totally do. But coffee grounds have a lot of nitrogen, and nitrogen is really, really important for the vegetative, with the green growth of the plant. So if you want your plant to get really big, I would look for a fertilizer that has a higher nitrogen value. So if the first number should be higher, right? Phosphorus is a mineral that is used in establishing the plant, right? So it's used for roots and blooming. So nitrogen, just think nitrogen's for leaves, phosphorus for flowers and roots. It's a little more complicated than that. Phosphorus really has to do with the total wellness of the plant, is to establish the plant. If you have a plant that's like just getting started, a fertilizer with higher phosphorus count will usually help the plant get more established quickly. You think like, oh, if I put more nitrogen, the plant can get bigger, but nitrogen is for leaves, it's for green growth. Phosphorus is really where the roots and the I would say the basis of the plant gets really, really established. You'll often see this kind of fertilizer with the higher number in the middle as like, let's say a 10, 30, 10. They're called bloom boosters, right? Bloom boosters. And that's kind of a marketing scheme a little bit, because it doesn't necessarily make the plant bloom. But if your plant is gonna bloom, it's gonna bloom nicer if you give it fertilizer. So if you see something that says like, we'll make your plants bloom, it doesn't usually make it bloom. It just helps the bloom get better, right? So if you have something like a fruit tree or flowering plants like orchids, around the summertime, it's when I start using a higher phosphorus count. I also use it when I have plants with a little bit of roots and I want them to get established. That's when I use phosphorus. Now, the potassium is something that's a little bit even more nebulous than phosphorus. Potassium, usually plants use it for stress and all around health, right? So potassium it's a mineral that plants utilize to kind of protect them against illnesses. I don't know if you guys have seen, there's a very viral TikTok or YouTube video about somebody that makes fertilizer with bananas, and they make the banana water, and a lot of people swear by that banana water. I've heard people make it wrong and it gets stinky. I haven't really tried it myself because I just always go with the bought version because I know what I'm getting. But the reason why that fertilizer works so well is because it has the lots of potassium, right, in that banana. That banana is bringing all these nutrients to keep away the stress, to establish the plant, but also protect it from illnesses, right? So if you see a random spot in your plant, like a random little brown spot, and it gets bigger and bigger, it might be an illness, it might be a virus. So something with a higher potassium count, mixed obviously with some treatment, might do the plant really good. And I see Francesca raising her hand.
Yeah, I had a rose that got the brown spots on it, and I threw a bunch of on top, and then I threw some dirt on top of that, and it really helped a lot. I didn't even, I just threw the peelings.
Yeah, the peelings might be just fine, right? So all of these things are things that we can use, and we don't often think about like bananas and coffee as like something that the plants could use, but it's something that we know. We know it works because our parents told us and everybody told us for years, right, that these things work, and it's because they do, and it's because of this NPK values, right? Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Did I lose anybody, or are we still good? Yeah, I see. Okay, we're still good. So some of the micronutrients, right? And this is really where we get nerdy, because this is a whole lot of information that to sift through to kind of really boil this down. But something we're really like come down are the micronutrients. And the main two that I think are the most important are calcium and magnesium, right? There's a fertilizer called CalMag, which is not a very creative name for calcium and magnesium. If I do have some plant lovers, you'll recognize Super Thrive. Super Thrive is a very popular fertilizer, and Super Thrive is calcium and magnesium mostly. It's mixed in there. These things do different things, right? The calcium, it helps with the blossoms. With if you think it's like your blooms are kind of dying. So if you have flower and it's kind of coming out, but it doesn't really come out, it ends up dying. It happens a lot in orchids. It might be calcium, right? Calcium helps with the structure of plants. Think about it like bones, right? Plants need bones in their own way. Calcium kind of helps those structures grow. So if you have something delicate like new leaves, if you have something like a new bloom coming out, some calcium might be helpful. What's the best way to get some calcium? There's eggshells. There's, we said Super Thrive, CalMag, all these fertilizers are things that you can use. Magnesium, on the other hand, it's not necessarily something the plants use, but it's something that helps them intake nitrogen and phosphorus, right? So magnesium is used by the plant to intake nitrogen and phosphorus, right? So magnesium helps with roots and leaves. This is basically the whole plant, right? That's what we really want. A really good source of magnesium is Epsom salts. I've seen some people talk and swear by Epsom salts and like Epsom salts bath, right? Epsom salts is just magnesium, like I think it's magnesium chloride is what Epsom salts are. They help really well to help the plant intake nitrogen and phosphorus. If you use tap water, your plants might get crystals, or our water is really hard. It has a lot of limestone. If you see your sink, it has that white texture. All of that's happening in your soil, right? So this nitrogen, this Epsom salt bath tends to kind of wash that away. So I use Epsom salts in plants that have very old soil that I keep fertilizing. And it's always important to fertilize every year, right? Whether you use a weekly solution every week, or if you do slow release, which are those little balls. There's some that I like. There's called, let's see if I pronounce it. It's called Osmocote, I think. I've only seen it written. I've never talked to anyone about it, but it's Osmocote, and it just looks like little caviar. Like it looks like eggs, right? You find it at Lowe's, you find it at Home Depot. Those are slow release fertilizers that you mix with your soil whenever you're getting your plant ready. I often switch it every year. I just get a new slow release in there, or I use the water soluble, because it just lets me not have to repot as much, right? And that's kind of just what I like.
Awesome. I want to pop in with some questions from the chat. So Martha had asked, what about those Miracle Grow packets? Are those good nutrient options for houseplants? And then there's one more question from Lulu asking, how do you extend the longevity of orchid blooms?
Yeah, very good questions. Now, I might spoil myself here, but I have a really controversial opinion when it comes to plants. I really like Miracle Grow, and a lot of people that grow plants don't like it at all. They like hate it, and it's hated by everybody. I know the companies had some like really weird, shady dealings with Monsanto and all those things, but I use Miracle Grow, so I do like the Miracle Grow, but I don't like the stakes. Right? You have fertilizing sticks. I don't like those. Those are not so very usable. If you're gonna use Miracle Grow, I would use the water soluble ones, and they usually have the crystal version, and it just looks like green or blue crystals. I would dilute that by half. Like we said, if the number is really high, it's probably synthetic, and I would weaken that, right? If the number is really low, it's probably a natural organic fertilizer, and that one you can even up, right? Those Miracle Grow, they're synthetic fertilizers. They do work, but I would lower the intensity so you don't burn your plants. To keep the longevity of the orchid blooms, again, I would focus in phosphorus, right? Phosphorus is kind of like the hardest one to get from a household condition, so that might have to be a purchase into the a purchase of a fertilizer, but it has to do with temperatures, right? If your house is too hot, orchid blooms won't last very long. If it's a little bit cooler, it'll last a little bit longer. So just keep in mind where you're keeping it in the window. If you keep it really close to the window, it might get really hot. So just try bringing it back a little bit just to reduce that heat stress. Now, I want to be conscious of our time because we have 10 minutes. Like I said, I could talk about this for hours. I love fertilizer. Fertilizer is where it's at. And I did see some.
This was very informative. I didn't know about NPK, and I was always very curious about fertilizers because I've burnt plants because I didn't know what the heck I was doing. So thank you. This is very, very helpful.
Yeah, this is like I don't know why this is like garden knowledge that we all know, because we all know about coffee, we all know about bananas, we all know about eggshells, but like the reason why they work, it's kind of like really dorky knowledge that like like not a lot of people get into, like the Google rabbit hole of finding into. All right, so I see Francesca has a question, and we'll get to Francesca's question before moving out to our next propagation. What's up, Francesca?
On the coffee ground and the banana peels, how often should I do that? Because sometimes I do it after we use the coffee and I just go out and throw it. And I'm just curious, am I supposed to be throwing it, or am I supposed to be like soaking it in water and just throwing out the coffee, or just doing the whole coffee grounds? How am I supposed to be doing it exactly?
Yeah, I think that depends, right? So I wouldn't put things there for too long. I feel like if you do want to take that extra effort to like be more meticulous, I would compost it, right? Composting it's really good way to just get all these things to break down and to be taken in easily for the plants, right? Compost is really, really good. You can buy compost, you can make compost, you can buy very small compost. So if you do want to be more meticulous, I would just compost them. If you want to just, a quick kick, I would just throw it in there and kind of let it happen. But if you're doing it frequently, might as well compost it.
So I have a quick question about compost too, because I've done little backyard, smaller bucket composts, and you get like the brown compost juice, the water, and then you also get like the soil part on the top. And different people use those things differently. I know some folks will just get the big jar and just water their plants like the way you would treat it with liquid fertilizer with the liquid part of the compost. And some folks only use the drier soil part of the compost and just kind of add it to your flower pots and water them like that. Is it the same thing?
It basically is, but it's just the way that the plants use it, right? The water, it's more concentrated, so it's more instant. The soil part is more like a slow release, right? All that dirt is really nutritious, right? So if you don't really want to worry about having to fertilize and you don't want to worry about saving this water, a lot of people just use the dirt that has a lot of nutrients, but they run out, right? And the water is something that you can use for your plants that you've had potted for a while. You haven't really like fertilized too much, so that would be perfect for that. So I would use it for different things, right? I would use the water to fertilize old plants and the soil to plant new plants.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Now let's really quickly get into a propagation, right? And I'll try to do this really fast for the sake of time. But I want to introduce everybody to a hormone that I freaking love in plant, and it's called auxin. Let me see if I can type it. I think that's how you spell it. I've read it, but it's a hormone in plants that is, I could do a whole dissertation on just auxin in plants. And it's basically, if you ever had a plant, growing, right? Your plant is growing, and then the window's right here, and it just tends to go towards the window. And you're like, why is my plant just doing this? So you have to rotate it and twist it, right? And it gets really leggy, and sometimes they get into really awkward positions. The hormone responsible for it is auxin. So auxin hates light. Auxin completely hates light, so it will tend to go to the other side. So if your plant is growing this way, I'm gonna just draw. Let's say this is a cactus. If your plant goes this way, the auxin at the tip of the plant, which is where it's produced, it's coming along downward, and it hates the light. This again, light. It hates light, so it's gonna want to come this way and make the cells of the plant longer, right? As auxin moves through the plant, the cells get larger, right? So this usually like how we keep plant growth, right? A plant to grow straight, right? Let's draw a tree, right? The sun is coming down from it. The auxin is moving downwards, and it's interacting with other hormones. There's ethylene, the cytokinin, all these really like important hormones and gases in the plant to create growth, right? But when it comes to propagation, auxin also inhibits the growth of lateral shoots, right? So I'm just going to draw a quick plant. I'll draw a leaf and then another leaf. So plants oftentimes have what is called a node or an eye, they call it an eye, or a growth point, right? And it'll be just little dots, right, on the axes of the leaves very often. Sometimes they're really random, like if it's a root, the thing can come from everywhere, but you'll see little dots. Let me see if I can move this plant here so I can show you. If we see here, right, we see this like little elbow almost, right? That is what we call a node. That's perfect for propagation. Usually we'll just cut right here, or we'll cut here, and this will grow a new plant. But auxin kind of prevents it, right? So in order to propagate, the best time to propagate, even if you do it in water, if you do it in dirt, if you do it in moss, because a lot of people propagate in moss, is just to do it when your plant has grown a new leaf and it got like it hardens. They call it hardening, right? So after your plant gets a new leaf and then it gets, a little bit more rigid, that's the best time to cut the head of the plant, because that's when the plant is producing auxin, right? We cut the head of the plant. This auxin here is not letting this plant, it's not inhibiting this growth, and you'll get a side shoot, right? And your plant will grow from the side.
Is that when people want to clip their plants down so that they get bushier?
Yeah, totally. So that's how they do it. I think they call it death heading. It's a really metal name for the practice, but you basically just cut the sides, and all these shoots on the side will grow. Now, if you're like me and you're cutting plants to sell or to share with friends, they won't really get bushier if they don't have a really strong root system. So if they're well established and they have lots of roots, you cut them, they get bushier. And that's usually what works best. Let me see if I can show you. I'm gonna switch to my face, and I know you got used to seeing my hand, so you might be like, who's this guy? Wait, switch over here. I have this plant here that I've propagated from immensely. So if you can see here, this is one plant that I cut here, and then it grew 2 shoots, and then I cut again, and now it has, 2 stems, but it's all one plant, right? Even this stem ends here, it goes on, and I just recently chopped off the head of these ones because I wanted it to get even more bushy, and I wanted it to get some growth from those bottom points, right? So if we switch over to our USB camera really quickly, all of these nodes right here, all of these grow points, they're dormant, but they're there, right? We cut off the head, we stop auxin, the production of auxin from coming down, and we can get more bushy plants that we can propagate, right? So that's something I thought I'd throw in there because it's something that a lot of people just chop plants and want to propagate them. But the best time to do it, and what I really recommend, is once you get a new leaf and that leaf looks like your other leaves, chop it, right? That's the best time. There's methods, water propagation, soil propagation. That all depends on your preference. I like moss and soil, but I know lots of people like water propagation. It just depends, really.
Nice. Mitzi Moore says that all of her pothos propagations failed, but the mother plant looks amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you'll often see that, the pothos really grow and get really large, and get those side roots. But I would recommend propagating once you get a new leaf. Cut that head, put those roots into, if it has roots, put those roots into some water, some soil. It should work, right? The plant is like perfect for cutting and propagating.
Yes. All right. We are exactly just before 5 p.m. Your timing is impeccable. Thank you so much, Juan. And thanks, everybody, for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording, but you all are welcome to stay on in case you have some last minute questions for Juan. But thank you all again so much. We really appreciate you.
Mm-hmm.
This
Yeah,
is great.